everyone. This is our power hour of the day. Power hours are skill builders for school leaders like you. And we hope that the topics are always very, very relevant and very, very useful and very, very informative to you. So we think that today will certainly be a great example of that. We are very, very happy to have Dr. Sagrario Rudecindo-O'Neill back with us. Sagrario is Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Student Support in Beacon City School District. And we're very happy when Sagrario is here because she's a frequent presenter for us at SAANYS on this topic. And it is always very
This
appreciated,
message has been
very well
transcribed.
received. So without any further delay, we'll turn it over. First of all, I just want to remind everyone, please stay muted unless it's a time when you're going to unmute to ask a question or make a comment. Other than that, I think we are ready to go. So take it away, Sagrario.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. So excited to be here today.
I'm not sure we have volume.
Oh, can you hear me?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited to be here today. Just give me 1 second. Just want to share my screen. Hold on. Sorry. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, so this afternoon, and again, we're going to be talking about RTI MTSS do's and don'ts. Now, obviously, this is a massive topic, so we only have really about 52 minutes today. So there's going to be a very condensed conversation that we're going to have today. My background is bilingual special education. I started as a bilingual special ed teacher in New York City, actually Washington Heights, District 6. So this is a labor of love for me. I've been doing this for over 20 years. And the conversation that we're going to have today around this topic, I want to preface this by saying that all this work, particularly some of the things that I'm going to discuss today in this short period of time, all this work has happened is because of the collaboration between myself, my administrators, and my teachers. And as we go through the conversation today, I want just to remind everyone that I think we do a great job of working with our caregivers and being able to use that lens of grace when we work with our children, when we work with our families. And I think it's very important that we extend that lens of grace also to our teachers, because our teachers in particular are doing a really, really, really hard job in this ever-changing landscape. And they do the best that they can with the information they have at the time. And for this work to really happen, there has to be buy-in. There has to be an understanding of where they fit in this role, in this process. And if there isn't a clear understanding of what RTI is, how they fit into the system, it is never going to work. So it's really, really important that you have your teachers on your side and that you're able to work in partnership with your teachers in this journey, on this journey. So we're going to just kind of tackle 3 basic things today. Today is we're going to use a do and don'ts lens to troubleshoot just common RTI breakdowns that happen, over referrals, missing progress monitoring, also understanding RTI should not be a delay for CSE referrals, because even though this is a general education initiative, it cannot be used as a delay to CSE referral if you truly have a student who will qualify for a CSE referral. How to apply a data-driven RTI cycle using clear entry and exit criteria, intervention integrity and documentation and data. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about how the work that I've done in Beacon, a little bit of our story, and what the things that we had to do in order to make our RTI system Again, it's not, I'm never going to say that it is a perfect system. There's no such thing. But basically, some of the things that we did to make it work for us. So I believe that RTI, and just like anything that we do in education, we have to come into it being curious, not judgmental. I love Ted Lasso. To me, it's like a perfect show. And when we look at RTI MTSS, I always tell my teachers and my staff when we walked into this and my administrators that we're always going to come in, always assuming positive intent and always staying student focused. And it's data over drama. And the reason that I say this is to oftentimes, the reason we get into trouble when we're talking about RTI is that too often people come in talking about gut feelings. And it's not about gut feelings, it's about data. The data has to be rooted in this work because it's about evidence. And your evidence takes you to the next step. I always say the data tells a story. Be curious and not judgmental, right? Because when we're looking at the data that it's in front of us, it's not about making judgment. It's about looking at the data and saying, what is this data telling us and how do we support our students? It should be a support model and not a deficit model. We want to see what a child can do and how we could support them. And then looking at that tier one, always looking at how we're supporting our students in tier one, which is your instructional practices within that classroom. So it doesn't become this whole thing that everything is a referral. So again, building a system that supports teachers and protects students. Okay. So what's created here on this slide is how we go through basically in a nutshell, a clear RTI model. So first of all, screening and identifying students. Think about right now in your particular building and in your district. Is there a clear and concise way that all students are screened and that all students are identified and that every single person actually knows about it? And after that process, is in your classroom, are students then being targeted in terms of when a student is struggling and is being identified? Are there needs of that student then being matched to an intervention? Specifically, not just being put into groups, but are they being matched? And is an intervention, explicit intervention, then being matched to that student? And then when that intervention is being identified, is an assessment then happening and with progress monitoring over and over and over again. So that someone is being able to say, I can see where their student is improving, or I can see where a student still needs support throughout time. And when that progress is being monitored, are they being able to say, I'm doing this explicit strategy over time in terms of 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 10, 20 minutes a day, and why, explicitly why? Are they able to prove if a student is responding to a particular intervention with fidelity? So is there a true explicit system, or are there just forms? Because oftentimes what happens is that there are a lot of forms going on, but not necessarily a system that everyone can speak to and that everyone is actually aware of. And that takes us back to the regulation. So if we want to ensure that we have a true system within our building, the best way is to use the actual regulation as our checklist. So when in doubt, we go back to the regulation. That is one of the things that we did in Beacon, where we were unsure of whether our system was working. We went to the actual regulation. So number one, the first bullet, it is a general education model. A general education initiative. When we're talking about in our school that RTI and what we're talking about, we're using RTI to refer kids for special education, then right there that you have a problem. Because special education should never be leaving anyone's list when we're talking about RTI, because that is a last resort. RTI is a general education initiative to support students in general education by qualified personnel. Then, are there universal screeners within your RTI process students who are not progressing? And by universal screeners are everyone is using the same screener. So it's apples to apples, oranges to oranges, right? And RTI talks about intensive targeted interventions matched to the student need. So it's not just about students being in small groups getting the same thing. Being in a small group is not considered an intervention. Repeated assessment, progress monitoring, including curriculum measures, which means that those 3 times a year that students are getting those benchmark assessments is not considered progress monitoring. That is not enough. That's one type of assessment, but it is not enough. Just state assessments at the end of the year, that is not enough, right? Your RTI meetings, what kind of decisions are being made? Are goals being identified? What instruction is being identified for those students? The services, the referrals. If we're talking about behavior, are behavior plans being identified? Who's working with the students? And then, of course, the last part, what kind of written notification is being given to parents? If parents are not a part of this process and if they don't know everything that's being done to support their child, then that is not a true RTI process. Okay. And this is also that last part about our parents and our caregivers. When they are left out of the process, this is where schools also get themselves into trouble. And this is where a lot of our lawsuits come from, right? Because they are being left out of the loop. Whenever a student is getting something more than what's happening in the classroom, or whenever a student is getting something more that's from the regular curriculum and our caregivers are not being notified, then that's a problem. We have to let our caregivers know when something more is being done, okay? Because they're our partners in this. All right. So that leads us to when we provide information to our caregivers, this is at minimum what we should be giving them. So what data is being collected? What services is being provided? Strategies to increase the rate of learning, and should we get to this point, that they have the right, I'm sorry. Go back. So sorry. I have a little. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. And should we get to that point of evaluation, that they have a right to special education, which is, again, the last resort. And we talk about data. So again, when a child's going through RTI, particularly that initial meeting, a parent should know whether their child is being referred to RTI. That's whoever is going to be providing any kind of service, whether it's the classroom teacher, whether at some point they're going to an AIS service, that parent needs to be notified and told who's going to be the person who's going to be providing the service. The parent should know what exactly is the intervention that's going to be given to the child, how long the intervention is going to be happening. And they should know whether their child is progressing within that intervention. Because then what ends up happening is the parents being kept in the loop. And then at no point is there ever an issue where a parent's going to turn around and say, the school never did anything for my child. And these things are very, very important, particularly if you ever get to the point where there's any kind of a lawsuit later on down the line. And then, of course, procedures for a referral. So again, if a student has not made adequate progress because again, after everything has been exhausted, then the school should proceed for a referral. Because you do not have to wait for a parent to make that referral. Then the school is responsible for making that CSE referral. Okay? But it has to be when RTI is implemented with integrity and when you're able to prove that you have basically have done that systematic, explicit process of your RTI process. Okay. Now going over the different tiers, right? The do. So tier 1, and tier 1 in a nutshell is your basic classroom instruction. And this is just very quick that I'm going to go through. We all know our tiers of support. Your basic classroom instruction, your tier 1, right? And your tier 1 is your classroom instruction by your classroom teacher and your curriculum. Tier 2 can also be your classroom teacher, when that classroom teacher is pulling those children for that small group because they need something more, if your classroom teacher has to do a behavior plan with a student because the student is struggling a little bit with the regular behavior plan in the classroom, that's also a tier 2 intervention, right? So tier 2, it could also be the AIS services, right? We know that tier 3 can also be if the school psychologist is now working with the child, is now seeing the guidance counselor. So we know what our tier 2 and tier 3 is, that outside intervention that's going on, right, in the classroom. But throughout these different tiers, this all has to be monitored if they're going through RTI, right? And then at the end, this decision making, because the biggest thing about the RTI, the strong RTI process, is how these decisions are being made, how it is being monitored, the materials that are being used throughout the monitor process, and how the students are moving throughout the tiers of RTI, right? How is that being tracked? How's that being scheduled, right? It also is who is making the decision? Who are the personnel involved? And of course, how is it being communicated with the families at the end, right? Because the other thing is, if there's a person who's delivering these particular services, and let's say that person's not qualified, so let's say a TA, for example, or a paraprofessional was the one who was implementing some of these services, that's not considered effective RTI support. It has to be a classroom teacher. It has to be a reading specialist. It has to be a school psychologist. So we have to look at those, exactly who's delivering the RTI services. Okay. So this is an example of an a goal written at an RTI meeting, because we want to talk a little bit about that. So this would be a student who teacher went through the RTI process, came in with data, right? She was working with the student on writing, still felt the student was struggling with writing, came into the committee with samples of writing that she was helping the student with. The committee decided that they were going to come up with a goal for the student, right? So the committee decided that they were going to give the student 8 weeks. And at the end of 8 weeks, the goal was that the student was going to write a single paragraph. It was, by the end of 8 weeks, given a single paragraph writing prompt. Using a graphic organizer, the student was going to write a paragraph that included a topic sentence, 3 supporting details, and a conclusion, scoring 3 out of 4 on a paragraph rubric across 3 consecutive samples, measuring 1 per week for 8 weeks. Now I'm going to break it down. So the target, so this was a goal that was selected at the RTI meeting, was a write, right? But it was going to be around composition and organization, because this was a student that was struggling to write a paragraph. So they wanted to help the student write 1 paragraph. They were going to use, the material was going to be a graphic organizer to help the student. They were going to give it 8 weeks. So once a week, the student was going to use a graphic organizer to help them write a paragraph that was going to include a topic sentence, 3 supporting details, and a conclusion. The measure that they were going to use was a rubric. Okay, the student had to score 3 out of 4 on this rubric 3 consecutive times, and once a week, he had to produce this paragraph for 8 weeks. And at the end of 8 weeks, they were going to go back to committee to see if the student improved their writing. That's a goal. That's an RTI goal. If the students show that using this graphic organizer helped improve their writing, then that's a successful goal. He can continue writing. He can continue using this graphic organizer. If the student at the end of 8 weeks showed that there was no improvement, was getting a 2 out of 4, a 1 out of 4, or inconsistently was getting, maybe 3 out of 4 one week, or 2 out of 4 another week, then we know that maybe this graphic organizer is not the best way to help the student. We might have to select a different type of graphic organizer. Or maybe the student needs more than once per week. With practice, maybe we have to do twice a week. Maybe we have to do 3 times a week. So if we decided that they needed twice a week, then we had to increase the frequency. And if we increase the frequency, then that's how we increase the intensity of of the support. Or he could go up the RTI support system and go into AIS. But it may be too early to go to AIS if this was the first time the student ever went into the RTI system, right? If it was the first time it was a referral. Now, there's an example of a goal given for a student that was struggling in math. So this one looks a little bit different. So this was a student that was struggling with multiplication. And as we know, in terms of times tables, most students struggle with 6, 7, and 8. Those are the numbers that the students struggle the most when it comes to multiplication tables, right? And we know that it's really important for students to be fluent in multiplication tables, because later on that they struggle then with division, then with fractions. So this is basically a foundational skill that they really must know. So if we wanted to help this particular student, we know that flashcards is a research-based strategy that really helps students when it comes to learning their multiplication tables. So this particular goal would be at the end of 6 weeks, given the table multiplication flashcards. Student would be given 1 minute, 3 times per week for 10 minutes, flashcards, or at least state the correct product with at least 90% accuracy, 12 out of 13 correct, across math drills, measured 5 times per week for 6 weeks. And this we do in a lot of our math programs, they have those drills. So this would be done for a period of 6 weeks with the flashcard. See if the student, after a while, will achieve 90% mastery. So we see here that the target skill would be multiplication. The frequency would be 3 times a week. Duration is 10 minutes. With the flashcards, the length of time, 6 weeks. The measure is the drills, the daily drills, and the materials is the flashcards. So this is very explicit. This would actually be shared with parents, so they know exactly what you would be doing. All right. And this is an example of a goal that would not be considered a good practice at an RTI meeting. So again, delaying an evaluation, coming up with something vague, like just saying, we're gonna give the child extra help, check-ins, small group, moving through tiers without any kind of true intervention or fidelity, coming up with a goal like that and then actually not doing it during the times that you agreed to do it. So let's say that goal was developed and the student was absent for many days. And then you came back with the data and the data was inconsistent because of the absences. Or the person who was supposed to do the goals was absent. Then you can't say that it was actually done because of absenteeism. You would have to continue until you had the actual weeks, right? Using only a single multiple data point, right? If you were only using the benchmarks as your data points, that's not considered appropriate. Overloading the system by referring everyone, right? We were saying that everyone was being referred, right? So that's not considered a good RTI system. Right. So again, the differences between a weak plan and a strong plan. So student gets extra help in a small group, and then it just checks in. So again, a lot of times we say that doing a small group is how we support students, but while small groups are great, but it's about what happens in that small group that makes the difference. Okay. So this is basically one of the things that we did in Beacon. So 5 years ago, when I started in Beacon, it was right after we came back from COVID, and we were looking at our RTI model. We had just reopened. And we realized that one of the things that we were struggling with was that we had multiple assessments that schools were using. So we did not have universal screeners across the district. Every school was using basically their own screeners. Every school was using their own forms to refer. We did not have any kind of uniformity or cohesion for our RTI model. So we knew that there was something that we needed to do in order to strengthen our RTI system. So one of the first things that we did was we literally just stopped all RTI referrals. We stopped. We said, we're just not doing this. And we took the time and we actually spent some time looking at what were the assessments that we had within our district that we thought was going to give us information that we truly needed to support our students. At the time, we were starting to use iReady. We liked the information that iReady was giving us. And then we implemented Dibbles in the spring of that year. And Dibbles was something that we wanted to continue to use. And we piloted Dibbles in just K2. And then we decided to give it to our students in K6 for the next. So then we started implementing a couple of other screeners for baselines for our students. Then we started adding a couple of other assessments in math. We started using Acadians and something called Delta, because there were certain components of math that we wanted multiple data points on that iReady was giving us. Because we didn't just want the iReady to be the only that was giving us information, and we wanted to be able to give it at different points of the year. We were a district that was doing foundations because it was an Orton Gillingham based program. So we got everyone retrained in foundations. And we did reach out to our local BOCES to look at basically looking at our tier 1 supports. We knew that we had students based on our data that were really struggling with reading. Because when we were looking at our referral rate for special education, we were almost at 20%. We were also looking at who was being referred to special education, and we didn't like what we were seeing. The students that were being referred were students that were very marginalized. And we knew that we had a problem there. So we had to address that. So we did a lot of reflecting around why these students were being referred and what we needed to do within the regular school hours at supporting them. Because this whole thing about tutoring kids after school, when students have problems with transportation and they can't come for tutoring, that wasn't going to work. So within school hours, how could we support our students? We knew we had to look at our curriculum as well. And we needed to look at our teaching practices. So one of the things that we also needed to do, that we needed to do a lot of training around explicit teaching practices. So we started looking at the work. We were doing a book study on explicit teaching practices. And instead of making everyone read the book, because we know, like I said, teachers have lives after school, we did book studies within our school district. And then we actually created a teacher, that's what it says on the thing, the TOLSA for RTI. We created a teacher on special assignment for response to intervention, basically a coach. And the coach was going into the classroom and supporting teachers on how to identify when students were struggling in the classroom, how to identify an evidence-based strategy, how to use an evidence-based strategy, and how to progress monitor in the classroom. We wanted a teacher to do it and not an administrator. In Beacon, we don't have directors. So we're a very small district. So my department is me, myself, and I. We use the money for teachers to support other teachers. It's not administrators that are doing any of the training or the coaching, it's other teachers. The teachers respond better to that. We did a lot of professional development on basically on teacher efficacy and on small group instruction that was actually effective. So not just on having kids in small groups, it's like, what do you do when the students are actually in those small groups? We taught them what to look for and how to track using data. Then we implemented new RTI forms and procedures. We did a lot of PD on tier 1 and tier 2, identified what our tier 1 and 2 really look like. We split our tier 2 into tier A and tier B, 2A and 2B. And then based on that, we then purchased materials that would support some of the work that we were doing in the classroom. We did not want to buy any curriculum until we had our teachers trained in really good tier 1 practices, because we didn't think it made sense to just buy materials if teachers didn't know how to use them. That didn't make any kind of sense. We also did not buy, we know there's a lot of programs out there that store a lot of this RTI work. We didn't want to buy any software until we knew what kind of screeners we wanted to have. We didn't want to buy any software until we knew what kind of forms we wanted to create and stuff like that, because we wanted to create a lot of this stuff ourselves and we wanted to be well versed in it. Now we're at a point that we are going to software that's going to house all the things that we did because we feel that we're very well versed in it. So with that, we started then creating, actually with the help of teachers, we started actually creating a bank of interventions where teachers will go and they can actually find reading strategies, tier 1 math strategies, writing strategy, graphic organizers, how to support students who needed support for executive functioning, OT, PT, everything that you can think of within these this Google Drive. They were not just strategies in how to support students, but there were videos that went along with it, instructions on how to implement the strategies. And again, when a teacher wasn't short on how to do, we had a coach that went in there and actually modeled it for the student. We also had forms that taught teachers on how to actually do the charting so they can chart the data. And we also taught them how to actually do a meeting. So we did a lot of modeling on what RTI meetings were supposed to look like. We identified goals and roles for each meeting, and we set up a whole system on what RTI was going to look like in our buildings. We also set up an entry and exit rubrics for our AIS program, as well as for our RTI and our RTI system. So this is what our tier 1, 2, and 3 looks like in Beacon. So we wanted to make it very clear, and this has been shared also with our caregivers. So our caregivers actually have a copy of this. So they know that if their child, what tier 1 means in our district is basically your classroom instruction, what tier 2 means, that it's and who's responsible, the frequency and duration. And they know in our district, we don't call our RTI meetings RTI, we call them IST, instructional support teams, because we wanted to use a more asset-based language versus deficit-based language. We also identify when a student no longer needs to be in RTI. So there's a whole exit process on when students no longer are in RTI. We created this at a glance, again, so that teachers have it in their classroom. That way, also when we have new staff, they have it and they get trained on it as well. This is kind of all the things that we did when we were going through basically our whole procedure. We also have caregiver letters for each step of the process, when it's an initial, when it's a follow-up, as well as when it's an exit. We also have caregiver letters when students are now in AIS because they are an RTI student versus a regular AIS student, because that is very different. AIS under Title I is different than being an RTI student, where they may exit differently than AIS. Okay. And what I wanted to kind of show you a little bit is that one of the things that we talked about also as a district was that for a long time, there's this whole thing about students who are in level 2 and working hard towards within RTI and in general, we're focusing on level 2 kids and pushing them to level 3. This whole belief that if we push these level 2 kids, they go into level 3, that increases student achievement. We decided not to do that in Beacon, and we decided actually to focus on level 1, with the understanding and the hope that if we focus on level 1, is actually, well, what I like to call it is kind of the bottom to the top, is that if you focus on supporting the student that needs the most support in the class, you actually get everyone. And what ends up happening is that if you support all of your level 1 kids, it actually pushes everyone along. So we've been doing this for the last 4 years, like really working with intensity with this mindset of supporting our level 1 kids. And what ended up happening, this is our latest scores. And if you look at our third graders in the 2023-2024 school year, 37% of our third graders, right, were proficient. And then if you look at them in fourth grade, 54% of them are proficient, which is significant. This is ELA. These are ELA scores, right? So they went up, and we know that this year's exam, it wasn't because it was an easier test, right? They went up. They went up about 16%. And then if you look at fourth grade, about 45% of our kids were proficient. And going into fifth grade, 54% of our kids went up. And then our fifth graders, 35%. And then when they went into sixth grade, 42%. Now, our middle school still wanted to work with this model of focusing on level 2. And I said, okay, go for it, because I actually wanted to compare. Now, when you look here at the comparison, so in 2024, we had 25% of our third graders were in level 1. Okay. And we worked really hard at supporting those students. When then you look at them in fourth grade, it was only 17% of them were still in level 1, which meant that we reduced 8%. We had an 8% reduction of those students in level 1. We had a 9% reduction level 2. And we had more kids going to level 4. So we did push we pushed more kids into level 3 and level 2, as opposed to just focusing on those level 2 kids. We did the same thing with our fourth grade going into fifth grade. We had more kids go into level 2, 3, and 4. By doing that, we had a reduction of level 1. And then when we went into fifth grade, going into sixth grade, we actually, and what I didn't put up here was that our fifth graders, when they went into sixth grade, we had a reduction of level 1 going into sixth grade. So what we're working on for this year is that we are continuing, again, our RTI is a K-12 model. So in the middle school, they have a full working RTI committee. That committee does also work on academics as well. They have iReady that they use. They also work on DIBELS all the way up to sixth grade. So sixth grade is still does use DIBELS. Seventh and eighth grade is piloting an intervention program this year for AIS. And the high school is also piloting this year an AIS intervention program because of the decoupling of the Regents exams that's coming up. Because we're looking at AIS differently, because we know that with the decoupling of the Regents, AIS can no longer be for the Regents exam. We're looking at making sure that our students that are in the high school who still have gaps are able to get some support, true support in reading and math, as opposed to having it as a test prep. We have teachers that are going to be level 1 Wilson trained in each one of our 5 buildings, so that students who need true Wilson support are getting it at all 3 levels, elementary, middle, and high. We have a coordinator at the high school that is coordinating all of the RTI meetings, and we have one also at the middle school. We have an RTI, we're continuing our RTI TOSAs at the elementary level. And we have all of our reading specialists are trained in multiple reading programs as well. That includes our ENL teachers as well as our special education teachers.
Sagrario, maybe we
oh, yes,
can,
please.
that's okay. Maybe we can take a minute and
Oh,
take a
sorry, I
look
couldn't
at,
talk.
that's okay, it's all good. Take a look at some of the questions that have
Oh,
come
yes,
up
sorry.
over in the chat. And also, we just to our listeners, we framed this discussion today as kind of do's and don'ts, and we've seen some of those do's and don'ts, and we've heard them in what we have listened to and heard so far. Feel free if you want to up in the chat, put a do, like something that really kind of stuck with you so far in terms of something good to do in your school or building with regard to RTI. I think the questions are interesting. The first one was interesting to me in terms of whether flashcards are a research-based strategy. And I want to just tell you what I found on my little AI friend over here. It said, yes, flashcards are a research-based
Yes.
method, especially when combined with evidence-based techniques like active recall, spaced repetition,
Yes.
retrieval practices. So there's really good info on a question
Yes.
like that for flashcards, and I assume also for graphic organizers, which came up.
Yes.
But
And yes, and
yeah.
actually, and thank you for bringing that up, because yes, and again, as a special ed teacher, flashcards, and again, does everything work for everyone? Absolutely not. But flashcards are considered a research-based strategy. Graphic organizers are a great strategy to use with kids. The FRARE model is a great one, especially for middle school and high school kids. We actually used the FRARE model a lot last year for our vocabulary goal. So last year in Beacon, as the assistant to, we had a district goal of vocabulary acquisition across all content area. So one of the things that everyone had to do was there had to be evidence of vocabulary being taught in every single classroom that I walked into, including PE. So I wanted to see how vocabulary was being taught. And some of the teachers, so I did introduce the FRARE method as a PD to all of the teachers. So that was a mandated PD that everyone had to take no matter what they taught in the district. And I didn't say that everyone had to have a word wall, but I kind of hinted that I would like to see word walls. But there was this very specific way that everyone had to teach vocabulary in Beacon. So it was very clear that I said, I didn't want to see anyone asking kids like, oh, what do you think this word means? No, none of that. Give them the definition. Give them the clear definition, because we need to stop.
Tell us again, what was the name of the method?
The FRARE model.
The FRARE model,
yeah. And there's different versions of it from elementary all the way up to upper grades. The elementary model, the students, you give them the definition, they give an example, a non-example, and they can draw a picture. In the upper grades, it's the definition of the word, an example, a non-example, and then a sentence. And they give characteristics of the word. Yeah, it's very, very concrete. It's great when you're introducing tier 2 and tier 3 words. Yes. And one of the things that we did particularly was that in the upper grades, we really wanted to make sure, particularly at the high school, that those tier 2 words were being taught across all content areas. So that the students, when they went into the different subjects, knew what those words meant in content. So that was kind of like a big thing. And a lot of the graphic organizers helped with that.
Yes.
Particularly for our students who are ENL students.
If anybody's wondering, that's FRAYER.
Any other questions? Because we got time. So
yeah, I want to ask something while we're talking about cards. We talked about flashcards a little bit, but I want to talk about the other cards. The goal cards that you showed as examples that were highlighted, and you kind of walked us through what the specifics were in those SMART goals for students. My first question is, where did they come from in your district?
Oh,
who made them?
I actually grabbed one from one of our students. So I went in and I got an example from one of our students, and I just color coded them. Okay. So that, because I was a special ed person, so I color code everything. So I wanted just to kind of show that when we're writing goals. So the point of that was when we're writing goals for our student, and this was one of the things that we did professional development with our teachers with, because what was happening was that when RTs were happening, people were struggling with coming up with goals for students. So
Right. That's a
initially,
struggle.
that was, people were sitting there, oh, the kid can't read, and I would sit in some of these meetings and I was like, no, 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 that tells me nothing. Like, what do you mean they can't read? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a student is struggling with CBC words? Is it a student where, is it long vowels? Like, what are we talking about? So we had to talk about being very, very explicit with
Right.
what is it the student is struggling with. And then when they were able to truly identify what they were noticing and say, okay, so let's talk about what's a goal, what's one thing that we're going to focus on. And then we talked about coming up with an explicit strategy, coming up with the frequency, coming up with the duration, and coming up with who was going to be then responsible. And so that's how we came up. So we came up with a little bit of a template
Right.
on
And
how
you
to do it.
mentioned banks, okay? Because I think many of us who are listening would agree that just this issue, who writes these goals, so that we have them available to use for our teachers to use.
Yes.
You mentioned that banks were being created. So in your
Yes.
district in Beacon, can a teacher go and find like a bank of cards, examples of
Yes.
interventions, so that
Yes.
everybody's not
So
reinventing the
we,
wheel all the
right.
time,
So
busting
was
their brain to do
that
it?
was that was the
Yeah.
responsibility of the uh, the TOSA and
Okay.
myself. We created a bank of interventions. So it was broken up by grade level and by subject. So a
Gotcha.
kindergarten teacher can go into their grade level, and there would be reading, there was math, there was OT, there was PT. They can kind of go in there and they can see all the different interventions. And if they were unsure of how to use something, the TOSA would go and model it for them. Because
Okay.
it's
So
true, a lot of our teachers don't know, and they wouldn't know, they were struggling with that. Like even like that
absolutely.
PRIMS book
Yeah.
that we would refer teachers to, they didn't even know how to use a lot of
No,
that because
no.
they weren't they
No, they
and it's
really
not
need
their
support with
fault.
that and, specific, explicit resources to use. And just one more question on that, because I know a lot comes down to this in terms of the actual, where are the interventions I can use? I don't know how to create
Mhm.
them, et cetera. Can AI, or maybe some of your teachers, or maybe some of you listening are using AI to create some of these interventions? I can see putting them in as prompts and, really, perhaps using AI just to generate very specific SMART goals around different tiers of instruction. I don't know, that's just more like a comment. I don't know if anybody who's listening or anyone else is just kind of dabbling in that a little bit to see if AI can be helpful in generating prompts that can be then used in a bank. But that's just something we'll kind of float out there. We can look at some of the comments now, and I think we're getting some answers there.
AI could be, as long as you have to look at the source, like Intervention Central is
Yep,
a good. So we Intervention Central, which was a really good one because Jim Wright's stuff is very,
yep.
very good. Um, I do know that, like I mentioned before, we're looking at Branching Minds as possibly the
Your volume went down a little bit.
yeah the program, the provider that we're going to be using. Now, what some of these programs do is that they have a bank in there, so you're able to kind of go in and put in like if a student is struggling with one particular thing, and those banks are already embedded in there.
Mhm.
So that's one way that you can do it as well. We were doing it ourselves. So it's interesting because we did so much of our own work that now that we're vetting companies, we have so many questions. The questions that we're asking them, they're kind of afraid of us because we're almost like a little bit more knowledgeable than them. We're like, well, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? Because we created a lot of our own stuff. So there are things that they actually are going to upload from our drive because they don't have it, because we custom made our own forms. So if you're right now in a place where you don't want to custom make your form, there are places that they'll do it for you. Now, the nice thing about some of these companies is that one of the do's and don'ts is that you may run up into a situation where these minutia things where you have your RTI meeting and you may have someone who will say contractually, well, who's taking notes? Right? I don't take notes. That's not my job. And I would tell you, I ran into that in one building. Of all the buildings in my district, one building. that the
Oh,
teachers
AI
usually
can
say they
take
don't
their
take
notes now.
notes, you know,
Yeah,
and it was silly, right? You
yeah.
see them like, what are you kidding me? And I had to like, Jesus, take the wheel, take a deep breath. And I'm like, okay, and I went there smiling and I was like, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I get it. You're right. Your contract doesn't say that. You don't take notes. Well, some of these programs will do the AI, well, they will record it for you. But you can talk right into it and you can have a
Notes.
meeting
Yeah.
and it'll transcribe it and fine. Even though there's one building I did, guilt them into it. And I said, that's fine. Don't take notes. That's okay. We're only here for kids. That's fine. Kind of
Maybe,
thing. And I just said that and
yeah.
everyone felt guilty. But if there's an issue like that, in your building, there may be, you can always, there are programs that you can do that. It will actually do the recording and you don't have to deal with union issues and stuff like
Right.
that. Cause I know that's
Or
another thing.
actual note taking beyond recording. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we can look at a couple of the questions. One
Yes.
wanted some distinction between RTI and MTSS. Difference between RTI
Oh,
and MTSS.
yeah.
And then
So,
there's another question around an MTSS system right here. Yeah.
okay. So response to intervention is regulation. So MTSS is um, uh, multi-tier system of support. So multi-tier system of support. So they're kind of like, I guess, interchangeable. But multi-tier system of support includes social emotional support. So when you're talking about students for behavior, because a lot of times we forget it's also for students that are struggling and need behavior support as well. So you have to remind teachers that it's not just about academics. So if you have a student that needs that support in the classroom, you know, that is not has to do with academics, that they should also be referring those kids to RTI. So that if they need those behavior plans, if they need support so for example, in our district, we use zones of regulation as a tier 2 support. So those students actually work with our social workers. And so that's something that's not in every single classroom, but that's a tier 2 support for those students who need it. So some of our students have weighed vests that we give them in our school. They don't need to have an IEP for that. Why? We just give it to them, but not every student needs that. So that's that going beyond. They go through RTI for that. So some of our kids also get like building level OT support. They go through RTI for that. So if the OT has time in their schedule, they pick up those students as well. We have some students who get building level PT support. They go through RTI for that, so it's not just for academics. Shouldn't a parent be aware of guidance psychologically for a student? Yes, absolutely. That's what we talk about, parent communication. So anytime, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I mentioned about constant parent communication, because some people forget to let the parents know, and the parents get very upset when they find out that a guidance counselor was giving building level support and no one told the parent. And you need consent for that. Like you can't just have kids being picked up and then the parents like, who, what, when, where, how? Like that gets very upsetting. Like you must let parents know, and if the service is continuing for the next year, you get new consent every single year. It's not an IEP. So every year you get new consent forms. So that's very important. Trying to see what else.
Question from Liz Amiot. When you have more than 50% of your students that are not meeting benchmark, isn't that a tier 1 issue? Wouldn't it be important to strengthen tier 1 instruction first?
So yes. So when you look at if there's more than 50%, absolutely you have a tier 1 issue. We had that in our district. That was one of the reasons why we did a lot of professional development on tier 1, because that's when we looked at we were like, whoa, because that was literally our first year because everyone was referring to RTI. And I was like, there's a problem. I couldn't say it out loud because we didn't want to hurt people's feelings, but we had to do some reflecting and say, well, wait a minute. Kids, can this possibly be true? Can it truly be that all these students, that's why I say that data tells a story, right? So let's really reflect on this, because is it really possible that 60% of our students need to be referred? Because that's how high our numbers were, 60%. And I said, so let's reflect on this. So let's talk about how we can tier this and really look at the students who truly need support, because there's no way, especially because we don't even have that many AIS teachers to begin with. So that's when we did a lot. That's how the reframing in our district happened, when we saw that those initial scores and everyone was like, oh, they all have to go to RTI. I was like, no. This is not possible. Yeah, so we worked a lot on those tier one supports, and we still, so this day, that's what we're doing. So actually the PD that we had today was on aligning foundations with the science of reading, so that our teachers really understand like why they're teaching foundations and how it's aligned to the science of reading, because we still have work to do. And again, not their fault, they weren't trained for it. They're teaching programs and not teaching this. I just want to make
We
sure that I
have
don't
time
miss
for
any.
one more question if anybody wants to either put it up in the chat or unmute and ask. One question is, will this PowerPoint be shared? What we do with these is we are going to post the recording of this session on the SAANYS website. Sometimes that takes a couple of days to do, but it will be posted there under professional learning. A little more about high school implementation.
Oh, okay. Yes. So at the high school, high school is it's pretty unique. So we started right now. We actually, because it used to be kind of like this committee that wasn't working, which is why we now have an actual RTI coordinator. And what we did was we started with ninth grade. So the incoming ninth graders, we used their iReady math and reading scores, and we identified first for lack of a better term, the 28th eighth incoming ninth graders who we felt needed the most support, and they went through an RTI process. We started with them and actually did a committee meetings with those students. And then and we identified using their iReady scores. So we gave all those scores to their departments, and the high school principal sat, and I walked them through how to read an iReady report, because they had never really looked at it. And then we talked about what was the areas that we felt they needed some support in, and we identified some goals with them. And that's how some of those students ended up in the pilot AIS program. So we're using this pilot AIS program to progress monitor to see how this AIS committee can continue. I mean, this RTI process can continue. We're also using the RTI committee to look at also behavior. So we have some students that are really struggling, particularly with chronic absenteeism. So the coordinator, we're using the committee to see how we're developing plans to have students come back into school. So we have basically some plans to get kids back into school. We have 5 students right now who are going through some severe chronic absenteeism that have gone through the committee that we're working on, that we have some checkpoints on. So that's how it's working right now in the high school. So the high school we've really been working on this year. So they were like my last stop, because high school is different, real different.
It's different. Sagrario, if people are leaving feeling that they like more support within their own schools and districts, perhaps some consulting in their schools and districts, what would be your advice to them?
This is such a huge, if we could figure something out, if people want to contact me, because this is kind of like huge, as you can imagine, but there are ways that you can do this, but you have to really come up with a 3-year plan. So you have to kind of do it piece by piece, and that's kind of how we did it at Beacon. So you have to basically start with kind of like a needs assessment. You have to start there. You have to come up with a 3-year plan. You have to find out who are the people who are going to be able to support your model. And then you have to see what money you're going to invest in it. Because those are the 3 things that you have to do in order to see how you're going to develop your plan. And then the other thing that you have to do is, this is something that you have to literally invest time, money, and energy throughout the process. Like, you can't let it go. It's something that, like, you're never done with it. It's never done, because it's like one of those things, like one of those sweaters that when it has like a little loose thread, it will completely unravel. It's that easy for it to unravel. It's unreal. So people will be like, what do you mean that's what we're doing? It's unreal. Like, you have to be consistently on it, because it will fall apart that easily. Like, I'm afraid that if I leave today, it will completely unravel. Like, that's how easy RTI will unravel.
It's that fragile.
It is that
And,
fragile.
I know that what everybody's going for is something that they feel is systemic, it's deeply baked in, and, that's an aspiration, but certainly the time and effort and energy put into just the process of continuing to deliver better services for students is really what it's all about. And as you said, it's not something that you put a bow on and end, that's for sure. It's certainly a work in progress. Thank you so much for being here today.